I never believed in anything I couldn't hold in my hands. That was always my way. My name is Calder Rentham, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a structural engineer in the Pacific Northwest. I built bridges, literal bridges, steel and concrete and mathematical precision. If you couldn't run a calculation on it, if you couldn't stress test it, if you couldn't prove it with numbers on a page, then as far as I was concerned, it simply didn't exist. That was my philosophy. That was the bedrock of who I was for 53 years of professional life. So when my grandmother Thessaly came back from the place she went, and I'm going to tell you exactly what she told me, word for word, because I wrote every single syllable down the moment she finished speaking. I want you to understand who is telling this story. I am not a mystic. I am not someone prone to visions or feelings or hunches. I am a man who once spent 11 days recalculating the load tolerances on a pedestrian overpass in Bellingham because the margin of error was 4 inches, and 4 inches wasn't good enough for me. And yet here I am. Because what Thessaly described to me in that hospital room changed the molecular structure of everything I thought I knew. Let me start from the beginning. My grandmother, Thessaly Rentham, was 92 years old when her heart stopped on the morning of March the 14th. She had been in declining health for about 8 months, a cascade of small failures, the way the body sometimes winds itself down like an old clockwork mechanism losing its last tension. She had lived independently until she was 89, which was itself remarkable. She gardened, she corresponded by handwritten letter with 4 friends she'd known since her 20s. She made a tomato soup from scratch that I still dream about. When the call came that she had been rushed to the hospital in Astoria, Oregon, I drove the 4 hours from Seattle without stopping. My cousin Orinthia was already there. My uncle Bassett arrived about 40 minutes after me. We sat in that waiting area with the humming fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic that hospitals all share, regardless of where you are in the world. And a doctor named Velasquez came out and told us that Thessaly's heart had stopped for approximately 7 minutes before they were able to restore a rhythm. 7 minutes. He used the clinical phrase, cardiac event. He told us she was stable, but that the next 24 hours would be critical. He told us she might experience some disorientation when she woke up, which was normal after oxygen deprivation of that duration. He was thorough and professional and kind, in that measured way that good doctors learn to be kind, with precision so as not to accidentally give false hope. What he did not prepare us for was Thessaly waking up and being the most alert, the most focused, the most completely present I had ever seen her in a decade. She didn't open her eyes gradually. She didn't flutter or moan or come back slowly the way you see in films. Her eyes opened like 2 shutters being thrown wide on a bright morning. And the first thing she said, the very first thing, before she asked where she was or who was in the room or whether she was alive, was this: Calder, I need Calder. Orinthia came and got me from the hallway. I walked into the room and Thessaly was already trying to sit up, already pulling at the monitors, and the nurse, a young man named Petrov with patient eyes, was gently pressing her back against the pillow and saying, "Easy, easy. You need to give yourself a moment." Thessaly looked at me across the room with an expression I had never seen on a human face before. Not fear, not relief, something I can only describe as urgency with depth to it, like she was carrying something enormous and had been waiting to put it down. She said, "Get something to write with." I found a pen in my jacket pocket. I tore the back pages from a visitor's pamphlet I'd been holding without realizing it. I sat in the chair beside her bed and I said, "I'm here, Graham. I'm listening." And she told me everything. She said that the moment her heart stopped, there was no darkness. That is the first thing I want you to understand, because it was the first thing she told me, and she was very specific about it. She said the word darkness isn't even the right framework, that it implies an absence of light, and what happened was more like the entire concept of darkness simply ceased to be a relevant category. There was no transition, there was no tunnel, which she found interesting because she had read about tunnels in various accounts over the years and felt slightly cheated, she said, with a small smile. There was simply elsewhere. She described it as standing in the middle of a landscape that was simultaneously vast and intimate. She said the colors were not colors she had names for. She tried several times to reach for comparisons, like standing inside a sunrise, she said at one point, then shook her head. Like being inside music, she tried. Then she said, "Calder, you know the feeling when you solve a problem you've been working on for a long time, and everything arranges itself perfectly, and for just 1 second before the satisfaction sets in, there's this pure clarity." I told her yes. She said, it was like being made entirely out of that moment. She was not alone in this place. There were others. She couldn't tell me how many because counting somehow wasn't applicable, but she was aware of presences the way you're aware of warmth. Distinct, individual, but not requiring your eyes to perceive. And then there was the figure. This is where I stopped breathing in that hospital room. This is where my pen pressed harder into the page, without me consciously deciding to press harder. She said he appeared, though appeared isn't right either. She kept correcting herself on the language, kept saying, the words are all wrong, they're all approximations, in a way that felt less like arrival and more like focus. Like when you're looking at something far away and your eyes slowly sharpen until the shape becomes clear. She knew who he was before he spoke. She said there was no question. She had grown up attending a Presbyterian church in Eastern Oregon. She had faith, but the quiet kind, the private kind that she never pressed onto anyone else. She said she had always wondered, in the way people privately wonder about these things, whether her belief was real or whether it was just the architecture of her upbringing. whether she actually believed or whether she had simply never had the opportunity to not believe. Standing in that place, she said, that question dissolved like salt in warm water. He did not have a glowing aura. He did not appear as a painting. She was very specific about this too. She seemed almost amused by the gap between depictions she had seen in her lifetime and what was in front of her. She said he looked the way a person looks when they are entirely themselves. No performance, no presentation, just presence without any of the layers that people spend their whole lives accumulating. He spoke to her and she said his voice was the strangest part, not because it was loud or supernatural, but because it was so completely ordinary. She said it was like hearing someone speak who had never once had to choose their words carefully, because the words and the meaning were always perfectly aligned. He called her by her name, her full name, Thessaly Marin Rentham, which she said she hadn't heard spoken in full since her mother died in 1987. He told her, "You cannot stay yet. There is something you need to carry back." She gripped my wrist when she got to this part. Her fingers were thinner than I remembered, but her grip was extraordinary. She said he showed her something, not like a screen, not like a projection. She kept reaching for the right metaphor and kept abandoning each one. She finally settled on this. It was like being inside a memory that hadn't happened yet. She saw America. She said she recognized it immediately. Not from any specific landmark, but from something in the texture of it, the feeling of the place, the way you can feel your hometown before you see a single familiar building. It was America in the present moment, in this year, in 2026, and what she was being shown was not a single event, but something she described as a condition. A state of being. She said the word she kept returning to, the word she said he used directly, not as a metaphor but as a diagnosis, was fracture. Not destruction, not apocalypse, not the dramatic vocabulary of catastrophe that we use in movies and news headlines. Fracture. The specific structural term for when something has been stressed past its tolerance and begins to separate along invisible lines that were always there, that the stress simply revealed. She said he showed her a nation of people who had stopped being able to hear one another. Not because they lacked words, they had an abundance of words. More words than any civilization in history, she said. Words everywhere, words pouring from every screen and speaker and device at every hour of every day. But she said what she witnessed was a kind of profound deafness beneath all the noise. People speaking without listening. People listening only to locate what they disagreed with so they could speak again. A feedback loop that had mistaken itself for conversation. She said she saw people who were exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't touch. Not physically exhausted, she was careful to distinguish this, but something deeper. As though the part of a person that generates meaning had been running continuously without rest and was beginning to fail. I'm going to pause here because I want to be honest with you about what happened to me in that moment. I am an engineer. I deal in measurable things. And sitting beside my 92-year-old grandmother, who had just been dead for 7 minutes, writing down her account of meeting Jesus in whatever territory exists beyond cardiac arrest, some part of me was running a parallel process the entire time. Some part of me was noting the oxygen deprivation, was cataloging the medical literature on near-death experiences, was constructing the rational framework that would allow me to file this experience under explicable, if unusual. But there was another part of me, and this is the part I wasn't expecting, that recognized what she was describing, not in a supernatural way, in the way that you recognize a diagnosis when you've been ignoring the symptoms for years. Because she was describing something I could feel, something I could look at my phone and feel within 30 seconds, something I could feel driving to work or reading the news, or trying to have a conversation about anything that mattered with someone who didn't already agree with me. The fracture she was describing wasn't abstract. It had texture. It had temperature. I recognized it the way you recognize the smell of your own house, so familiar you stop registering it until someone from outside comments, and suddenly you can't stop smelling it. I kept writing. She told me the warning was not a punishment. This was important to her. She came back to it more than once, made sure I had written it down clearly. She said the entire experience was saturated with what she could only describe as love that had removed all self-interest from itself, and that the warning came from within that love, not against it. He told her, tell them that they are not too far gone. Tell them the fracture can be mended, but they have to choose to stop. Stop what? I asked her. She said he was specific. Stop performing belief instead of practicing it. Stop using faith as an identity accessory rather than a navigational instrument. Stop speaking about love as a value while practicing contempt as a reflex. Stop consuming outrage as entertainment and then wondering why they feel no peace. Stop raising their children to win arguments instead of to build bridges. And here she looked at me directly when she said, build bridges, and I felt that in the base of my rib cage. She said he showed her something else then, a counter-image. She described it as the same landscape, the same people, the same country, but altered in quality rather than circumstance. The circumstances were the same. The difficulties were the same, but there was a different quality to how people were moving through those circumstances, a different quality to how they were looking at one another. She described it as people remembering something they had forgotten, not learning something new, remembering. She said it looked like people choosing in small moments, in individual, private, unremarkable moments, to act from their better nature rather than their defended one. Choosing to listen past the point where they thought they already knew what the other person was going to say. Choosing to be generous in interpretation before being skeptical. Choosing to treat the people directly in front of them with the kind of attention that costs something. She said it looked, in aggregate, like an extraordinary amount of small decisions accumulating into something that changed the texture of everything. He spoke to her one more time before she came back. She said he looked at her with an expression she doesn't have language for. She tried tenderness and discarded it as too small, tried recognition and said that was closer, finally settled on the way you look at someone when you know them completely and love them anyway, but without any of the grief that phrase usually carries in human experience. He said, "Thessaly, you have lived well. The parts you regret were smaller than you believe them to be. The parts you dismissed were larger. Go back and tell your grandson that the bridge he builds next will be the most important work of his life." She did not know what that meant. She told me she didn't know if it was literal or metaphorical. She told me she was just the messenger, and that part of the message was mine to interpret. I'm still interpreting it. She died 4 days later. Peacefully, in the same hospital, with Orinthia and Bassett and me in the room. Her second departure was nothing like her first, she had told me, anticipating it with something that looked from the outside remarkably like calm preparation. She had letters to write. She had specific instructions about her garden. She had a conversation with Orinthia about something private that Orinthia has not shared with me and I have not asked about. On the morning of the day she died, she held my hand and said, "It's exactly the same place, Calder. I could already feel it at the edges this morning. It's still there." She was gone by afternoon. I have spent the months since then doing something I did not expect to spend my 60s doing, which is sitting with the unquantifiable, running no calculations, accepting that some load-bearing structures are not made of materials I know how to measure. I have thought about the fracture she described until I can see it everywhere. And then I have tried to look past it to the counter image, the one where people are remembering something. I have tried, with genuinely mixed success, to be a person who listens past the point where I think I know what's coming. I have tried to interpret generously before I interpret skeptically. I have failed at this more often than I've succeeded, if I'm being honest. But I have kept trying in a way that I wouldn't have before March the 14th. The bridge she mentioned, I don't know yet. I have ideas. There is a project beginning in my professional periphery that may or may not be what she was pointing at. I am paying attention in a way I previously wouldn't have thought necessary. What I know is this. A 92-year-old woman who had lived a quiet, careful, honest life went somewhere the rest of us haven't been yet, and came back with a message that was not designed to frighten. It was designed to remind. And the reminder was simple enough that I'm almost embarrassed by how straightforwardly I can state it. You are not too far gone, but you have to choose to stop. I'm Calder Rentham. I'm an engineer who builds bridges. I don't have a congregation or a pulpit or a television ministry. I have a notepad with Thessaly's words written on the backs of hospital pamphlet pages. And I have this story, and I have the conviction, running on whatever the opposite of blind faith is. Call it earned faith. Call it faith that came in through the side door when the front door was double bolted, that it matters. If you've listened this far, there's a reason you've listened this far. I believe that with the same certainty I believe in load tolerances and material stress thresholds. Not everything that holds weight is visible. Whatever you're carrying into this year, whatever fracture you can feel in your own life or in the lives of the people around you, she said it's mendable. He said it's mendable. I'm saying it because they said it and because I wrote it down in a hospital room in Astoria, Oregon, while my hands were shaking. And shaking hands are another thing I don't have a precedent for in my own history. One small decision, then another, then another. That's the bridge. If this account reached you and something in it moved something in you, if you found yourself recognizing what Thessaly described the way I recognized it in that hospital room, then consider subscribing to this channel. Not because the numbers matter, but because the people who need to hear this are still out there. And the only way to reach them is to reach more people. And the only way to reach more people is for this story to keep traveling. Thessaly would have found the whole mechanism of it, algorithms and subscriptions and digital reach, completely baffling. She wrote letters by hand, but she understood that a message worth carrying deserves to be carried as far as it can go. Subscribe. Share it with someone who's tired in the way she described. Let it keep moving. She'd want that.